If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode was Dr. Anna Tarrant from the University of Lincoln, and Anna's work revolves around gender, masculinity, family, fatherhood, grandfatherhood. And I was really interested to talk to Anna because she uses a very rich methodology in terms of how she gains her data. And her research focuses, as I said, on fatherhood from as young as 14 all the way up to the age of around 72. And so a fascinating piece of research. I think you're going to enjoy this one. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Do you want to start by introducing yourself, please?
Yes, my name's Dr. Anna Tarrant. I'm an Associate Professor in Sociology at the University of Lincoln, and I'm also a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow at the moment as well.
Thank you, Anna. Where did sociology start for you then?
Well, I actually started out as a social geographer by training through my undergraduate degree that I did at Lancaster University. But my career has been interdisciplinary. So I did my PhD at Lancaster University as well, based in social geography. But that took me on a route through to sociology, essentially. And sociological theory and research has always underpinned the way I think about the social world and the way I analyse the data that I've generated with participants. After my PhD, I got a job at the Open University working with Professor Breege Featherstone, who is Professor in Social Work and renowned for research on fatherhood. And together we did some projects looking at contemporary experiences of fathering and also grandparenting as well. And that led to the development of a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellowship, examining the experiences of men in low-income contexts and families to look at their role, essentially, and the positive value that can bring when they're involved in the lives of their children. And that's when I basically moved through to sociology. So it was based at the School of Sociology and Social Policy at Leeds University. I was working with Dr. Karen Hughes, who's a sociologist herself, and her work was really inspiring, and her way of thinking about family life and about low-income family life in particular really sort of helped to frame my thinking around men's involvement. So then I identified an opportunity at Lincoln University. There was a lectureship available in sociology, which was the first permanent position in academia as well. And I took that opportunity linked to family requirements as well in some cases. But it allowed me to sort of really embed myself in sociology as a discipline.
Great. And you mentioned quite a few areas there: family, fatherhood, masculinity, gender. What sort of research has influenced you?
So going back to my Lancaster University days, Peter Hopkins's module introduced me to the work of Raewyn Connell. I was really interested in gender and how gender shapes particular forms of inequalities and social experience. But something about Connell's theorisation of masculinities really inspired me and struck a chord with me. And I think it was one of the first really important frameworks for thinking about masculinities being multiply constituted. So I was really interested in the ideas around hegemonic masculinity, and then how men in different social positions, how we might theorise their lives and their experiences. And I developed that kind of thinking and those interests through my undergraduate dissertation, which focused on grandfatherhood. So I have fond memories of doing a focus group with my own granddad and some of his friends and other men who are granddads, and talking about their family lives. And it was really lovely, and it generated some really interesting data about the life course, and about how caring roles come to be organised across the life course, and again produced some really interesting findings around how ageing influences men's conceptions of themselves, and that was really the start for conceptualising ageing masculinities, which was an area that I published through my PhD and developed further. I was also really inspired by Doreen Massey's work as well as a geographer and focus on relationality and social relations, but also David Morgan's works, and the now sadly late David Morgan's work on family practices. So his work was really inspiring in terms of thinking about the family not as a fixed or static institution, but as something that we do, and something that's performative. So that again really shaped my thinking around how granddads engage with their grandchildren, with their family members. I mentioned Karen Hughes earlier, so I think that most of my inspiration has actually been my sort of strong female academic mentors. So Breege Featherstone, as I say, her work was incredibly inspiring, particularly around interdisciplinary perspectives on fatherhoods and fathering, and how that might help us to think about the context in which we support men to be engaged in their family lives. And then obviously, the work of Karen, and also Bren Neal, who has done some amazing work around family life as well, and thinking about family dynamically, and their work is fed into and really informs my own thinking and my own work today.
Great, thank you, Anna. And we're gonna talk about your own work. And to start with, I'm quite intrigued. Fatherhood and grandfatherhood. Maybe this is a bit sexist of me, but why do you focus more on the male side rather than motherhood and grandmothers?
There's several reasons. From a personal perspective, I've had really strong, good men in my life, and a big part of my upbringing. So my own dad has been incredibly supportive of me and everything that I do, and my granddad as well, always really interested in his grandchildren, and fond memories of being with him. And he's now 86 and still so interested in our lives and what we do, and really caring, I would say, which inspired me, I think, and I recognised, I think, early on in the reading I was doing, that if men are positively involved in family lives, that's good for everybody, and it's good for the well-being of families, and it's good for the well-being of men, women and children. I kind of recognised through my reading and through my engagements with the literature that there was a lot of empirical emphasis on women's roles in the family, and that's obviously linked to the histories of feminism as well, and how feminists have thought about family life, and focus on men, particularly at that time, was burgeoning, and was a clear empirical gap. So it's linked a little bit to my personal experiences, but then also to an identification that men's voices in the context of family, and in terms of theorising men as gendered subjects in their own right, was a gap, and an area worth pursuing. So it was linked to those two things, I think.
That's really interesting. So it's kind of an under-researched area?
Yeah, but particularly at the time when I was doing my PhD. So I started my PhD in 2007, and certainly there was literature beginning to emerge, focusing on fatherhood and focusing on caring kinds of masculinities, although it wasn't conceptualised in that way at the time. That's a more recent kind of development, I'd say, in the theoretical debates. But grandfathers in particular were an area of absence. Ageing men were beginning to attract more empirical attention, particularly in social gerontology. So in 2004, Tony Calasanti wrote a really interesting paper about thinking intersectionally about ageing for men, and again theorising men as gendered subjects in their own right, but also dealing with processes of ageing as well. And her work on age relations again was actually really inspiring in terms of thinking about that. So I ended up settling on this focus on grandfatherhood, and thinking about gender divisions of labour across the life course, thinking about how men's positive engagements really do support the well-being of families, and that data was really, really interesting. I mean, one thing these men were really aware of was that that having the time in their later life to engage in their families, to be involved in their children's lives, was really valued by them, and they developed these really interesting comparative kind of narratives, if you like, around the value of that time with their families. And of course these men were actually they were very resourced. So these were from essentially middle class families, if you like. So they'd had years of employment, this very traditional set up in terms of gender roles, and some of that did feed through into their narratives as grandfathers. So they talked very much about being the Butlin's red coat, being the fun granddad, while grandma does the baking and all of the kind of crafty activities, and also the cleaning and and all those kind of traditional gendered domestic activities. So that kind of that shift and that dissonance almost in their narratives was really interesting, and said something to me about change and continuity in terms of how we think about gendered roles in the family.
I did actually read an article recently. It was in a psychology article rather than sociological, but it said, I don't know how true this is, Anna, maybe you know, that men become more maternal, or rather I should say paternal, as they get older, and women less so. So among grandparents, quite often the grandfather takes a bigger role than the grandmother. Have you identified anything to do with that?
I think that's an interesting perspective, and there's a really great book, Do Men Mother, which reflects on some of those themes. I wouldn't necessarily say that people become less paternal or more maternal. I think there's more interesting analyses to be had in terms of social context, and how that shapes people's ability, if you like, to engage in different forms of social reproduction or employment. So I certainly think that the grandfathers expressed some regret actually, when they actually could reflect and say, I've actually had time now to engage in the lives of my grandchildren and my children, and I've really enjoyed those aspects. I certainly think that it develops a new understanding between couples, particularly if they remain in couple relationships. So something that I'm talking about in my forthcoming book, based on my Leverhulme Trust study, Men, Poverty, Lifetimes of Care, is that grandfathers in these low-income contexts are stepping in and providing care as the primary with primary responsibility for grandchildren, and saying, actually, I'm really understanding how hard looking after and raising children is, and how hard that must have been for my wife or my partner. So it's developing these new forms of understanding between these couples that is really interesting in terms of how we think about progress towards gender equality, I think, and that division of labour and how that might change and ebb and flow over the life course. So I wouldn't say it's about people becoming more paternal or less maternal over time, but more that I think roles change and social contexts change, and that influences how people do gender and how they think about it.
Yeah. So let's go into a bit more detail about your own research then. Do you mind just telling us about kind of your methodology first, how you collect your research data?
Yep. So I'm a qualitative researcher, and always have been. So my first sort of foray into social research, as I mentioned, was my undergraduate dissertation, and I conducted a focus group with my granddad, as I said, and some other men, and I've taken focus group methodology forward in several studies as well. But generally, I've conducted biographical interviews. I'm really interested in life history and kind of a temporal perspective and way of thinking, and developing that through research methods. So one of the most insightful things that I've always done in my interviews is just start with a question, tell me about yourself and how you came to be where you are. And really fascinatingly, and particularly with the older men that I've done my interviews with, they always start with employment histories. So they always talk about the work that they've done, and often I have to prompt a little bit more to find out more about their family lives. So that kind of the construction of identity around breadwinning is particularly strong, and it seems to be something that men have led with in the interviews. More recently, I've developed a kind of, or engaged in a range of different sets of methodologies. So one area that I've developed that it was completely unexpected actually, but built through the Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellowship work, was engagement and reuse of existing qualitative data. And I've been developing a methodology with Tarrant Hughes around qualitative secondary analysis, and we've recently published a book with Sage about developments in that field, and that's been really fascinating actually. It's a relatively new area, so for years and years and years we've been analysing quantitative secondary data sets, or quantitative data sets I should say, but engagements with qualitative data has raised a lot of debate and discussion, and particularly around epistemological questions, ethical questions, and also practical questions about how researchers come to data that they didn't generate themselves or weren't involved in the process of data generation. And we're very much at a point now where those debates are not resolved as such, but we've developed important languages and approaches that allow us to recognise or develop the value of that kind of approach. So we're also developing infrastructures all the time as well. So the Timescapes archive, based at the University of Leeds, is an exemplar really of how we build questions of archiving and data preservation into our current work and the current field work that we do. So through my current study, which is the Following Young Fathers Further and funded by the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship, we're actually building in archiving information sheets, and we're asking our participants to consent to allowing their data to be preserved for the historical record. So those developments are really exciting, and mean that we can, understand much longer social histories and preserve the voices of marginalised groups. I've also, through my Leverhulme Trust Fellowship, been dabbling with ethnographic research methods as well. So I spent a period of time in a community centre doing participant observation with men in low-income contexts. And again, that was really insightful in terms of thinking about how trajectories of deprivation impact on men's connections to their family lives and impact on their relationships. And I developed, kind of accidentally really, something that I call walking photo voice. And that's again informed by biographical methods and informed by some new methodological debates around walking methods, which are gaining popularity in sociology and social science, and particularly led by Maggie O'Neill. So what I did is I gave these men some cameras and asked them to take me around their locality and reflect on what they liked about their locality, what they maybe disliked, what some of the social problems were, and then also what it's like to be a man, to grow up in those areas. And that helped me to produce and generate some really interesting insights and data, again, around how older men navigate post-industrial, deindustrialized spaces. And again, I think that contributes to a body of literature that's based around the experiences of young men particularly. So this work allows us to look across the life course, look longitudinally and intergenerationally, and do that using visual and creative methodologies. So a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah, but all based on that. Yeah, all based on that idea of trying to get rich, detailed information, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, that really thick description, but also in a way that's dynamic and it's informed by qualitative longitudinal inquiry. And
then if we just think about the sample, so the diversity of men that you used within your sample, you mentioned some low-income earning men. Who else was included in the sample?
So my sample was actually, for the Men, Poverty and Lifetimes of Care study, was actually informed by my qualitative secondary analysis work. So what I did was I accessed data, two sets of data that were archived in the Timescapes archive. So they were from studies called Following Young Fathers, which was directed by Bren Neal and Carmen Lau-Clayton, and then Intergenerational Exchange, which was directed by Karen Hughes and Nick Emmel. What we knew before I engaged with the data was that, through existing outputs, through conversations with the project directors, that they focused on men's experiences of family life in low income contexts, but from different generational positions. So Following Young Fathers looked at the experiences of young men aged 25 and under, and then Intergenerational Exchange focused on midlife grandparents. So they were aged between about 35 and 55, and they were providing different forms of either informal or formal kinship care. So essentially they'd had some engagements with the courts, and there'd been some child protection issues, maybe through neglect or deprivation related neglect, and were caring for grandchildren and stepping in and supporting them, and really investing in those grandchildren's futures, really. And that raised a lot of questions for me around whether we could develop analyses across those data sets and whether we could bring those data sets into analytical conversation in an effective way. And we found that we could actually do that, and we could develop some really interesting findings and analyses and interpretations from bringing those data sets together. But given the sort of differently constituted nature of those data sets, there were also limits to what we were able to do. So from that, I developed a study design for men, poverty and lifetimes of care that allowed me to develop a wider spectrum of perspectives from men of different stages of the life course. So that included young fathers, and I interviewed young fathers as young as 14 actually, for that study, all the way through to kinship carers who were in their 70s actually. So I had one who was a great grandfather and was 72 and was raising a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old following, again, kind of, these really these traumatic histories actually linked to deprivation that were experienced by some of his family members, including his daughter and granddaughter. And again, that kind of informed by the secondary analysis work allowed me to do, I think, more specific comparative work looking at how different generational, or men in different generational positions, step in essentially to sustain their families at different points in time. So it was focused on a very different set of questions to the QSA work, but the QSA work I think enhanced the kinds of questions I was able to ask, and also informed how I developed a theoretically rooted sample as well of fathers and grandfathers.
That's a good broad sample, 14 to 72 as well. I like
Yes.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's been challenging to develop analyses, but I think actually because of the grounding in qualitative longitudinal inquiry, and the focus on generation and conceptualizing generation, that's been actually really helpful, because actually my focus is more on the trajectories that lead to their engagements in family or disconnect them from family, and I'm finding some really fascinating things and identifying patterns around different impacts of deprivation on these men. So the young fathers in particular tend to become disconnected from the lives of their children. And I do think that is linked to challenges engaging in the labour market, inflexible work, precarious work, whereas the older men have a longer history where they've been able to build up resources, and actually are more able to step in to provide care for those children or grandchildren and keep them in the family, because they are the most resourced in their families.
Yes.
So it's been really fascinating to draw out some of those differences, but then also see some similarities in terms of how they're conceptualizing being there for their kids, being there for their grandchildren, fulfilling promises almost for other family members, because otherwise those children go to the care system, and they're lost to the families. So all of those things provide this really rich life course perspective on these trajectories, and interestingly as well, we're looking at the idea of older men and the cases of older men being data proxies for the younger fathers. So are we able to think about what young men's trajectories in the long term might look like by looking at the cases of older men who have been young fathers themselves, and then have, are able to reflect on their life histories. So that's some work and some analyses that we're trying to think through at the moment as well.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. That's going to be the end of part 1. In part 2, what I'd like to do is hear about some of those case study examples. Hi, welcome back to part 2 of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Anna Tarrant. Anna, in part 1, you mentioned about how you set up a lot of your research. Do you mind telling us, just maybe start with one of the examples of the fathers that you spoke to?
Yeah, definitely. Well, my research interests have originated in research around grandfathers. So I think the cases of the grandfathers who are kinship carers in particular have been the ones that really stand out for me as being really fascinating and sort of theoretically and empirically inspiring in lots of ways, actually. I might go back, I think, to I call him Pierce, that's a pseudonym, but Pierce basically talks a lot about becoming a primary caregiver for his 2 young grandchildren. So he explains that he had been a lorry driver for many years, and it transpires that his 2 young grandchildren have been neglected, require care, and social services ring him and his wife while they're actually on holiday in Turkey and say, we've got 2 grandchildren, your 2 grandchildren here, you need to come and get them, or we're going to have to think through whether they go into the care system, whether they need fostering. So they fly home, and within the space of a day, he and his wife have to make a decision about whether to keep those grandchildren. He decides that having had many years working as a lorry driver, that he'd like to be the primary caregiver. His wife was also working as a pharmacist, and had spent about 5 years going full time, having raised the children and having done that. So he becomes the main caregiver for those grandchildren, and he's so reflective of kind of the challenges that creates for him emotionally. He says it's exhausting work, but also really rewarding as well. It carries a lot of ambiguity as well, particularly around how he feels about his son and his son's partner, and their lack of ability actually and capability to provide a safe home for his grandchildren. And he's very careful about suggesting that that social services sort of have this perspective that apples don't fall far from the tree, but actually it couldn't be further from that, and that they're very very capable as grandparents of raising these grandchildren. So all of those kind of those challenges and those ambiguities are really embedded in his narrative. He also then reflects later in the interview about the challenges of having a special guardianship order, so a legal order which gives him and his wife parental responsibility for those children until they turn 18. And one thing that he talks about, and that's actually talked about by a lot of the older men in the sample, is that they really struggle then to re-enter the workforce. So Pierce is 56. He's taken time out from employment to raise those children, to settle those children into the family context, this new family circumstances, and finding flexible work that fits around school hours, that pays enough to make childcare affordable, is really, really challenging for someone of his age. And he's really conscious that he's not far off retiring as well, and that he maybe is less desirable as an employee to keep for the longer term. So he's grappling with all of these issues around employment, around childcare, at the age of 56. Also in a role that's pretty stigmatized. He's stigmatized as someone who's a man providing that care, and he talks about the discomfort of dropping the children off at the local school because he's the only older man who's there, and he's really conscious of kind of the looks he might get from the mums that are in the playground, and some of the kind of concerns that being an older man in a playground raises, particularly in the context where we sexualize men. and we make assumptions about why they might be interested in children, and that's a theme that's cropped up through several of my research studies, actually, particularly around aging and older men. Is how they're perceived in spaces for where care is provided. But what's really lovely, I think, about his particular narrative is that he does talk about this understanding that he's developed with his wife. Having experienced raising children on an everyday basis, he says we're now able to have more adult conversation and understanding conversation about how difficult this is. So that was a really kind of interesting finding, I think.
That is a really interesting case study, that one. Certainly, like you said, the stereotypes of the attachments towards an older man looking after the children. That's interesting. What about the other end of the scale? You mentioned younger fathers, as young as 14. Do you mind telling us about one of those case studies?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Well, I haven't really talked about this yet, but my current study, Following Your Fathers Further, it follows on from Following Your Fathers as a baseline study, and will extend the qualitative longitudinal findings from that study for up to the next 7 years. So it's a really exciting investment in terms of the work in terms of research on young fatherhood. It's a really it's an interesting process doing research with a 14-year-old young father who was grappling with very similar issues to those that I was grappling with at the time that I did the interview. So I'd not long become a mum for the first time myself, albeit at the age of 27 rather than 14. And in a way, I think parenting is an interesting process in that it's a challenging process for everybody. You don't sleep, and you're adjusting to a new identity as a parent, and you're trying to get to know your child, and all of those things actually are really exciting. But as a 14-year-old, some of the deprivations of the contexts in which they're parenting make it much more challenging. And there were 2 young dads I interviewed, actually, who were 14, and with very different circumstances. So one was seeing his child weekly. They were living in different homes. So the baby was living with the mum, who was also living with her mum. So again, there's kind of some informal kinship care there from the grandparent. And that young dad was going to visit and staying overnight when he could. One thing that comes out really strongly from the Following Your Fathers study is that grandparents play a really key role in gatekeeping for young fathers. So in this case, the grandmother liked him, wanted him to be involved, and saw the value of him being involved and supporting her child, and that was really positive for him. And the other young dad, there were actually questions over his paternity, so that was a really interesting case. So he thought of himself as a young father, but the conditions leading up to him becoming a father were tricky. So he was in and out of relationship with the mother of the child, and she'd had other boyfriends and other partners, and he hadn't actually seen his child when it was born, and wasn't even sure if he was biologically related. But nonetheless, it did impact on his identity and who he was. It impacted on his schooling, so he expressed a lot of anger, and also tried to commit suicide at one point, all linked to the anxieties around whether he was a father or not, and whether and linked to the fact that he couldn't have access to that child. And again, in that case, the grandparents were gatekeeping, and felt that it wasn't suitable for him to be involved in the life of that child, so that kind of excluded him from his access. And one thing we're trying to develop through the work we're doing around young fatherhood is really trying to challenge how young men become sidelined, not just in family context, but also in terms of practice and policy support as well. So often these young men come into contact with a range of agencies, including social services, but also support services as well. And we're really finding that if services engage directly with young dads, bring them into the work, even just ask them, how are you doing, how are you, that can have really transformative effects, and it acknowledges that those young men are parents as well, and it does break down some of those kind of gendered assumptions that do carry through in how young men think about their parenting, and how young men's parenting is framed as well. There was another case in a project that I was involved with, where we were trying to develop more father inclusive forms of practice through a model called the Young Dads Collective, which is something, again, we're extending in the Following Your Fathers Further study. And a young dad was basically in a room with the mother of his child and a social worker, and the social worker and his partner had their back to him, and they were bathing the baby, and the social worker was explaining to the mum, this is how you do it, so you hold the baby's head here, you splash the water here, and going through those processes. The young dad was behind them rolling a cigarette. He was waiting basically for the social worker to turn around and show him how to bath the baby, and he said, if that social worker had turned around and done that, it would have helped me raise my confidence in supporting that child, and also shown that I'm important, and that I have a role to play for that parent. So just those little tweaks in practice can actually have really important implications and ramifications for ensuring that dads are brought into that work in positive ways.
I was going to ask, is that quite a common theme? Because you mentioned exclusion of access. I think a lot of males do worry about that. They are concerned about that they're not seen in the same light as the mother. And particularly if the relationship breaks down or fails, or if a marriage ends in divorce, there's often that fear of being excluded from the child, isn't there?
Yeah, certainly, and there's some really interesting research around non-resident fatherhood, and the assumption with non-resident fatherhood is that they're absent just simply because they're living in a different household, and if we non-resident fathers tend to live in poverty, or tend to be more live in context of deprivation, and again that's linked to being in a lone, a single household, and again their access can be challenged in living in a different household, but actually we also find that very active forms of engagements with children, so children will either stay with fathers in their houses, or they spend quality time together doing a range of other different activities outside of the home. We do have an argument I'm developing at the moment through my forthcoming book, based on Men, Poverty and Lifetimes of Care, is very much around how child maintenance reinforces men as financial providers, and that sits very uneasily with the men that I'm researching with. They basically say, I spend a lot of the week with that child, but then through the child's maintenance service, I'm being told that basically I'm an absent father if I don't pay this money, and again in these contexts and in the cases that I've been learning about, there are men who are in one household, who have new partnerships. They have their potentially have children and grandchildren that they're looking after in one household, but then from the perspective of the child maintenance service, if they're not paying child maintenance to their ex-partner and child, then they're seen as absent fathers, and they're not doing this not paying because they don't care about that child, or they don't have an investment in that child's life, but it's often because they're trying to manage limited resources in the context of one household. So one of the cases from intergenerational exchange, he was called Victor, is a classic example of this. So he's got a new partner, Carolyn. She has 4 children, and one of those children has a grandson who they provide informal care for. His ex-partner, who he explains is basically working but not declaring it to the tax office, she's supporting his son, Adam. And he says, I've become a household because if I have full-time employment, I'm not going to be able to afford to resource both sets of households, and especially when my ex-partner is working but then not declaring declaring her what she's doing. So all of those kinds of complexities don't align with how policy frames fathers, essentially, and all of those contexts again feed into these ideas around absence and challenges around access that don't align with the lived realities and the messiness of family relationships.
Yeah, it seems to reinforce that idea that males are just a financial provision, a financial provider rather than anything else, doesn't it? It does actually remind me, I went to see a talk once, and it was by a feminist who was giving a talk talking about motherhood. And she talked about the burden of motherhood. And there was a couple next to me who got quite angry at that. And the woman said to me, motherhood is not a burden, it's an honour. And the man also said, he was quite angry with that. It was like, because he'd missed his child's first words, his child's first steps, because he was expected to work. And they both got quite angry and frustrated by this idea of motherhood being seen as a burden when they thought it was quite an honour to be a parent.
Yeah, and that's, again, I think that's where we need to think about context as well. So I think so COVID-19 and the lockdown has obviously impacted on family lives in really disproportionate ways, and I think, as we're finding, is exacerbating gender inequalities in some ways. But it's also, for those in employment, I think provided an opportunity for more men to engage in their family lives, and to actually spend that time with their children that they miss, through being at work 12 hours a day, or for long periods of time. And I think, having that opportunity to balance employment and childcare is something that we're not supporting currently, and is something we need to work towards more. And it's a really interesting, I say, a tension as such in the narratives of young fathers in particular, because they talk about wanting to be there for their children, but they also want to be a breadwinner too. They want to be in employment, and it's Townsend calls it the package deal. So the marriage, employment, and family life. So those arenas sit in tension with one another. And when employment and working in long hours then impacts on family lives, that can then reinforce those inequalities between men and women, and then how we think about and shape parenthood as well.
Yeah. If anything good can come out of the pandemic, it would be interesting to see if people readjust, their family life balance, and maybe more gender equality as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, the pandemic hopefully will be a catalyst for change. And I think, as social scientists and as researchers, we have a duty and a role to inform some of that change in positive ways. And we're certainly trying to do that through the Following Your Fathers Further study. So we've become part of a consortium of researchers as part of a Nuffield Foundation funded study called COVID Realities, that's led by Ruth Patrick and Kayla Garthwaite and Maddie Power, and they're working in close conjunction with the Child Poverty Action Group as well. And essentially we're working collaboratively with a range of studies that are taking place across the UK to understand the impacts that COVID-19 and the lockdown has had on low-income family life, and our intention, is to inform policy and to reflect on, using empirical evidence, reflect on how we might change things for the better. So there's focus on, particularly on the benefits of universal credit, and how more funding or more support for the welfare system benefits families. But there's also, I think, some interesting questions to reflect on around shifts in gendered roles and gendered responsibilities in family context as well, linked to work and care.
Yeah, and that's what I like, real sociology, not just researching, but actually making change as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and informing policy. I know that there are distinctions between what sociologists do and social policy, and I certainly think sociologists, we do a lot of theoretical work, and I think we're in a context now where we can also directly speak to speak to policymakers and develop interpretations of evidence that's good enough to inform and catalyse change. And I think we've got a role to play in preserving that data for the historical record too, to allow kind of more theorising and developing understanding and knowledge in the longer term, to track those changes and as they unfold essentially.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna. It's really, really interesting, fascinating research. Do you mind telling the listeners how they can find out more about your work?
Yes, certainly. So the Following Your Fathers Further study is currently in progress. That commenced in January 2020. I lead a small team, so Laura Way, Lindsay Ladlow, and we've got an administrator, Ben Handysides, who's also a young dad himself. We're developing research in collaboration with a range of organisations across the UK at the moment, and also trying to internationalise research on young fathers as well by working with partners in Sweden, so Thomas Johansson and Jesper Andreasen. So we're publishing, we're doing wave one of that work at the moment, and we'll be publishing about that work as and when we are ready to. We've got a website called Following Your Fathers Further, so you just need to search for that in Google and that will come up, and that's where we basically are updating people on what's going on with that project. So all that information is there. You can also follow me on Twitter at Dr. A. Tarrant as well. So I often I try and interject into certain debates when I can, and also talk about recent outputs and publications as well, and developments in debates there. So please do follow me on there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today, Anna. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.